Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Hilda Wangdu, and I chair the program committee here at the Winchester Historical Society. We are excited to kick off our 2023 spring season with tonight's program on historic homes and structures. Could not have anyone better to lead this discussion other than Winchester's own Matthew Brodsky. At Simpson, Gumpertz, and Hager, Matthew leads the preservation practice across their nationwide offices. He has over 25 years focused on investigating and diagnosing the causes and consequences of historic buildings and designing sensitive and appropriate repairs and restorations. He has worked on some local significant structures such as the Trinity Church in Boston and Frank Lloyd Wright's Zimmerman House in Manchester, among many others. Matthew has taught at Harvard University, the Getty Center in Los Angeles, Boston Architectural College, and he's also served here locally at the Winchester Historic Commission for 7 years. I am pleased to introduce Matthew. So I want to take it away, Matthew.
All right, here we go.
Excellent.
So thanks so much for having me this evening. Really happy to be here. Lived in Winchester a long time and great to get together with a group of friends virtually tonight. So obviously I'm going to be talking about decoding the logic of historic construction from Winchester to Rome and really trying to tie back some of our local examples of architecture to how we understand them, not just stylistically, but more so technically how they really work, and hoping to have a little fun with it. But just a little disclaimer before I get started is, although we're going to be looking at a lot of local examples of really logical, rational construction, not all construction is logical or rational anywhere, and that includes Winchester. So just for example, I strolled through one of our favorite courtyards the other day, and just such a little romantic place. And you kind of look up at that balcony and almost think, oh, two people could be having a conversation across those two balconies, thinking of Juliet up in that little balcony. And then you walk a little farther and you realize, that isn't really a balcony at all. It's kind of a fake balcony. You can't really get there. There's no door. And on the other side, there's no way to get there too without climbing over a wall or a parapet from a roof. So not everything is always what it appears to be, particularly when you get into the late 19th century and early 20th century and romantic eclecticism and just these ideas of making kind of beautiful romantic spaces. And so construction logic doesn't always prevail there. And one other little local example, just right down the street from me, my son's elementary school, Lincoln. What is that doing there? Is that some sort of keystone? Is that a corbel for a big beam that was never built? What is it? It is not doing anything. It is just purely decorative. So not everything that you see walking around Winchester that might be beautiful or really not, beautifully detailed is logical, but there really is a lot here. So that's what we're going to kind of focus on tonight is what is the logic, what are the materials, how are things really made, and how are they built? So just to get started, I'd kind of like to go through all this and then really open it up at the end for questions and answers. But I'm going to ask a few questions now. And if you could just type anything you're thinking into the chat, then we can kind of have a little fun with it that way. So let's start with a little game of what material is this? So over here is a beautiful house at a five-way intersection of where Wildwood takes a sharp bend. And you probably all know this house. What material is that on the left? It's just a gorgeous color. It has a beautiful patina. You drive by it and you probably think, maybe that's French limestone. I'm not really sure. It's a little warmer than the limestone you typically see around here. How about over here on the right at the Church of the Episcopal, I believe? Right above the archway, some beautiful arch stones. What are they made of? Well, here's a close-up of that house on the left. Gives you a little bit more of a hint. And let's look at a couple other things. So how about the public safety building, better known as the fire station on the left? There's a close-up of those stone pilasters. There's Cafe Nero, really beautiful building, the Liederman block. And on the right, McCall, and a close-up of each of these. So kind of the big hint here is all three of these and the two prior materials that I just showed are all the same. How about next? Let's look at our two bridges in the historic center. Same material. So if you guessed concrete, and if you called it concrete, if you called it cast stone, if you called it architectural concrete, really technically it's all the same material and you would have been right. So, you might not tell your friends, oh, Winchester Center is a really beautiful place. There's a lot of concrete. That's not how we usually describe it, but there is quite a bit there. It's just really beautifully designed, beautifully patinaed early 20th century concrete. So how about here? What material are these? So this is the Winchester Unitarian Church. That's the original 1899 portion of the building on the right, and that's the 1928 portion on the left. So from this distance, and I'm pretty close, probably 12, 15 feet away, those really look the same. But in reality, the one on the right is natural limestone, and the one on the left is what's often called cast stone in the early 1920s, and what's really concrete, but it's just concrete that they went to great lengths and efforts to make it look like stone. So there isn't really a technical difference so much as there's an aesthetic difference. So I hope these close-ups will help you in being able to tell the difference between the two. So on the left, you can see, and from that distance, they're really virtually indistinguishable. And even maybe from 6 feet, it's just really hard to tell, because they tried to make it look like stone, and they were pretty darn good at it in the early 20th century. But when you get up really close, like you see here with my fingernails, the cast stone or architectural concrete on the left, what you're really seeing is little pieces of aggregate, little pebbles, little pieces of crushed stone, and sand, and kind of cement that's usually tinted, kind of a beige color to make it look more like limestone. And you can see that up close. All the particles are kind of about the same size pebble. They're all about kind of Rice Krispie size or a little bit smaller even. And on the right, in that natural limestone, you'll see a different structure. You see those fossils, see the little shells and kind of fossils and creatures in the limestone, and kind of a different shape of the particles, not as round and pebble-like, and a little more irregular and fossil-like. So those were both just shot with my iPhone, no special close-ups or anything. And that's really what you can see with your naked eye and how you can tell the difference between the two. And as you walk around Winchester Center, you actually see a lot of both. So we do have a lot of natural stone in the center. We have a lot of really good cast stone, and it can be hard to tell the difference. So kind of going from left to right here across the bottom of the screen, here at the bank on the left, those columns are actually natural limestone. And even from this distance, you can kind of see kind of the swirly pattern of the natural sedimentary grains in the limestone. And the base is natural granite. Now on the second one from the left, so this is kind of the block where Starbucks is and where that courtyard is. So that's natural granite on the bottom. That might have been a later modification, just kind of a guess based on the polished nature of that and the thin slabs. But up above, that is cast stone masquerading as limestone. And even from this distance, you can start to see kind of the little tiny Rice Krispie size pebbles in there. On the right, that's our third from the left, one from the right is 75 Church Street. And the upper part's painted, so I can't really tell, but the lower part, that's concrete, cast stone, masquerading as granite this time. So in this case, instead of kind of selecting the aggregate and tinting the paste to look like limestone, kind of white and just a very subtle off-white beige, here they've gone for kind of a cold gray, some white aggregate, some black aggregate, trying to mimic the diorite and the other, the biotite and muscovite, the constituent and feldspar, the constituent minerals in granite. So doing a pretty good job. And then over there on the far right, that's actually a close-up of the post office, and that's natural limestone. So I get this question a lot. Why does old concrete look so much better? Everything you're showing me looks really good. Why can't we make concrete like that today? Why does it look so stark, so cold, so white, so gray? So really the technical reason for this is even if they didn't make an attempt to make it look exactly like stone, if they didn't try to pick just the right color aggregate to look like granite or the right color to look like limestone, when they freshly cast that concrete way back in 1928 or whenever on this particular building, when we cast concrete, there are kind of two basic parts to it. There's paste, which is the cement and the water, and then there's aggregate, which is both sand, which we call fine aggregate, and pebbles and crushed stones, which we call coarse aggregate. So here I'm kind of representing those as one, as the kind of brown particles in there, and I'm representing the cement in this case is gray. It could be gray or white. You could buy both then, and you can buy both still today. So essentially you've got this mix of two different color things, kind of in this case the pale gray paste and the brown pebbles and sand. And when we cast the concrete, there's a phenomenon known as paste float. So all the paste floats to the surface. So when they trowel it, when they form it, when they pour it into molds and kind of tamp it and compact it, the paste floats to the outer surfaces. So when it's fresh cast on day one, which is the left side, you're seeing essentially all the color of the paste. So today, when we pour concrete, a foundation, a sidewalk, anything, we use white or gray cement. You see white or gray, and it's very stark on day one. But what happens over time is that paste weathers pretty quickly. And so that's starting to wear away. And in the middle photo, you're starting to see some of the aggregate. And then as it weathers more and more over time in many winters, you're seeing more and more and more of the aggregate on the surface, including the sand. So it really takes on the color of the aggregate, and in particular the sand, which is often a beige. So that's why we go from kind of that warm, that cold gray or white to that much warmer kind of sand color. And then so that arrow across the bottom is really showing you that. And visually, kind of like a pointillist painting, your eye is blending the two from a distance. So on day one, you're seeing almost all paste, and then you're blending and your eye sees more and more and more of the beige, and that's blending together. So we go from left to right across this over time, both as it weathers and your perception of that color. So how about this beautiful bridge that we all kind of know and love here in Winchester Center? You're seeing the aggregate exposed. It's taken on the color of the sand, that kind of pinkish, warm aggregate color, really, really prominent today, and also really a nice visual texture to it. So I contend that this looked pretty cold and harsh and smooth and not textured at all on day one. And as evidence, I will offer up a book that many of you probably have right on your bookshelf at home. So let's look at this photo you've probably seen many times before a little more closely. Look at how flat and flush and stark and smooth that is. So that's really the paste float. And, we can't tell so much with this kind of sepia tone photograph, but really just by the amount of paste float that's there, you can tell it hadn't yet weathered to expose the aggregate. And that was just the pure paste color on day one. So I contend that this bridge probably looks a lot better today than it did on day one. And so when we see some brand new concrete like the sidewalk here on the right, you might say, oh, gee, I wish they had kind of tinted it to match the more beige, warmer color concrete on the facade. But over time, it will gradually work its way toward that, and it will gradually get there. Mother Nature will help it along. So fear not. So I'd like to talk a bit about a few different structural things, and we're going to start with beams and lintels. So we see a lot of lintels in stone kind of here in Winchester Center, and over on the right, I took a photo of the Stoneham Library right up on Main Street just because that's a particularly good example. So stone is not a very good material for making beams. And you might have learned way back when in architectural history class, the Greeks built with stone beams, post and beams and columns and lintels. And then the Romans came in and showed how to build with the arch. And that's really true. But let's just take a look at the proportions of these while we're here for a minute. So if you look at the depth of the beam, which let's take the center one, that's much more clear. So from top of this stone lintel or beam to the bottom, and then the width that it's spanning, so the width of this opening, the proportions here are maybe 1:4, maybe 1:4 or 5, 1 to maybe 2.5, 1 to 2.5 or 3. It's not going very far. So it has to be very deep and it can't span that far at all. And that's what you probably learned about kind of the limitations of the way the Greeks built, which is really like the temple front, the Greek temple front of our post office on the left. So you can do it, takes a lot of stone, it can't go that far structurally. Now, by way of contrast, or first, let's introduce a slight variation. So here in the center of town, this is actually a granite slab bridge. So I recall when I was on the historical commission, this came up. At the time, it had a big concrete parapet that was in tough shape, was really falling apart. The town engineer looked at it, said, the stone slab bridge is in great shape. The parapet's really in rough shape. So we advocated for doing what they've actually done, which is replace that with an iron railing. And as part of our flood widening project, it gained the fourth culvert on the right. So the fourth culvert on the right is modern concrete. It's faced with stone to try to look like it belongs. And the 3 openings on the left are the historic stone bridge. And I think there are only something like 17 of these left in Massachusetts. So it's essentially big granite slabs. So not just beams, but those extend back under the roadway, sitting on granite piers or columns. So this is really building, like Stonehenge. This bridge is built like Stonehenge, and it's doing quite well today. And granite holds up well to de-icing salts, which we use a lot of. So it's doing great. Now here it's really probably about maybe, 1:5, the depth to span ratio. So pretty consistent with what you see up above. So the reason that building with stone beams and stone lintels and slabs is so limiting is essentially when we use a beam or a slab, we're putting it in flexure. So you put a load on it, someone stands on it, a car goes over it, it snows on it, you have a force in the middle, and that beam deflects. And what's really happening is, so the top part is before it's loaded, it's straight. And as it's loaded and it deflects or flexes, and all materials do this, you see it more in things like steel or wood than you do in stone, but all materials deflect. And as they deflect, the top is actually getting shorter. So you can imagine if we drew lines across that beam, the top is getting kind of squeezed in. So the top of the beam is in compression and the bottom is being elongated. So the bottom is in tension. And one of the particular properties of stone is that it's very, very strong in compression and very weak in tension. So that's why it's so limiting to build in it, like the Greeks did, or like those few examples we just looked at. It's pretty limiting how far you can go, and it has to be pretty deep. So comparison, wood and steel are about the same, roughly the same strength and tension and compression. So they really work well as beams for that reason. So here's a wood beam on the back of Town Hall at the second floor porch or balcony. And you can see here the ratio is maybe more like 15, 17, maybe even 20 to 1, as opposed to our 1 to 3, 4, or 5. So it can just go a lot longer relative to its own weight and depth. So, well, then how do you build efficiently and effectively in stone? So as you might have learned from the Romans, it's really with arches and vaults. And really the thing about arches and vaults is they use the material, the stone material, and the way that it's strong, which is in compression. So just a little bit of kind of engineering background in here. So Thomas Hooke, really an early innovator in physics and structural engineering in the 18th century, said that as hangs the flexible chain, so but inverted stands the arch. So here are a few diagrams from my colleague and friend Paul Kasabian at work, who also teaches structural engineering at some of the local area colleges. If you imagine a cord or a chain or a cable and we hang some weights on it, it will approximate a shape relative to the weights and the location that they're placed on this cable or cord and the weight of the cable or cord itself. So here are just a few examples of that. And what Hooke was really saying is a cord, a string, a cable, a piece of fishing line, any type of cord or cable can only take tension. It can't take compression. So if you kind of hang those weights on it and try to shift it to one side, it will come back to that kind of perfect shape for static equilibrium to be fulfilled. And so what he was really saying is, since that's in pure tension, a string or a cord can only take tension. If you flip that upside down, you get a structure that's in perfect compression, in pure compression for that same load case. So that's kind of the basis of some early engineering of arches, and kind of a fun exercise I did with some kids I mentored a few years ago at Morocco who were interested in design and construction was they wanted to make a dome. And so we got cheesecloth and we hung it by the four corners and draped it in plaster of Paris. So it was in pure tension. And after the plaster of Paris cured, we flipped it upside down, and it was they were designing for a stadium behind Morocco. So that was a kind of a fun exercise we all did. And Gaudí famously designed some vaults of Sagrada Familia the same way. So pure tension up above, pure compression down at the bottom. And of course, if I go back for just a second, that case is with a uniform loading. That means we're kind of loading the whole thing. We've got weight on the whole thing at once, and it's pretty even. So it works really well for that. So if it's designed for that and you load it eccentrically, meaning way off to one side and a lot of weight off to one side, that's when you can get a failure in an arch. So that's the kind of case you want to avoid. So arches are very happy when they have a lot of weight on them, because it's kind of uniform and concentric. They don't like to have a lot of weight in one place off to the side at an angle. Even a lot of weight right down the center is okay. So let's look at a few semicircular arches here in Winchester Center. So on the left, that's the North Mark Bank. In the center, that's the Bookends building. And over on the right, that's City Hall, Town Hall, I'm so sorry, Town Hall. So even with a semicircular arch, which is typically what the Romans built with, there's still some thrust at the edge. Not all the force at the bottom of the arch is coming straight down. So I've kind of shown that diagrammatically on the right. Most of that stress and force is coming straight down, but there is a thrust action outward. It's not as great as on shallower arches, and we'll look at that in a minute. So if we get to a segmental arch, a very shallow curved arch, then the horizontal component starts to increase and the vertical component decreases. And kind of an extreme example of that is a flat arch. So here, the library has some really beautiful examples of flat arches in granite and that are true load-bearing flat arches. There aren't steel lintels under most of these that I've looked at. So here it becomes the opposite. The horizontal thrust is the much greater proportion of it, and the vertical portion is smaller. So I've represented that graphically kind of here on the center photo. And over on the left, you can think of this, getting back to our cable and string and weight case, as a cable that has one weight in the center of it, but or maybe a series of small weights, but it's pulled very taut. So the forces become mostly horizontal here because of the angle that you're pulling the cable or fastening the cable. So another fun little game here. Let's just put your answers right into the chart. Now that you know what a flat arch is, I just showed you a couple at the library, and a lintel is a beam. Which would you say these are? Flat arches, or are they beam/lintel? So McCall Middle School. McCall has a lot of these. I took a photo of one. I'm showing it right here. Boy, it's a little bit tricky. It kind of looks like it could be, is that a keystone in the middle? Is it like a flat arch with a keystone and kind of some imposts at the end to take the thrust? It looks to me, I couldn't get up super close to check these for sure, but it does look like this one is actually a concrete lintel that's just kind of decoratively cast in that form to make it look a little bit more like a flat arch with a keystone. How about these two on Lincoln Elementary? So from a distance, that bottom one sure looks like a lintel, right? It's just kind of a rectangle, maybe some relief or some sort of carving in it, but it's fairly uniform rectangle just going right across the opening. That upper level, that looks like it could be a flat arch, kind of looks like a keystone. The edges are splayed. So, from a distance, I would think lintel on the bottom and flat arch on top. But this is really interesting. When you look at these closely, first of all, they're not stone and they're not cast stone. So these are architectural terracotta as the material, and they are flat arches. But what's interesting is the one at the top more or less corresponds with what you see from a distance. They've just created an extra joint. So from a distance, it looks like 3 pieces. When you get up close, it's actually 5 pieces, and they have kind of an interlocking, almost puzzle connection between them. So as they were setting them, they were stable just as they dropped them in, which is really clever. And on the bottom, it's actually kind of the same thing structurally. When you look at how the pieces work, it's a flat arch with very similar joints, but they've just articulated it differently to make it read different visually. So very, very clever kind of engineering and architectural interface here on the side of Lincoln. Jettied construction. So jettied is kind of the more general term for this type of heavy timber construction that you see in Elizabethan architecture. You see it in Tudor architecture. We see it here in Winchester and Tudor Revival architecture. So, kind of an expressed heavy timber frame and kind of corbelling or jettying one floor out past the floor below, and then another floor out past the floor below. So it kind of keeps stepping up as it goes. So really some beautiful examples. And, there was kind of an evolution of this kind of period revival architecture. So, these buildings to me look like they're the 1900s and the early 19-teens when, the kind of reproduction and recreation of these period styles was really faithful and very good, particularly in the hands of some of our skilled early 20th century Winchester architects. So these are really, some pretty characteristic details. You could go to England, you could go to Bohemia and Northern Europe, and you could see, buildings that were 300 or 400 years old and looked very much like this. So nice kind of recreation of the detailing, use of actual heavy timbers in a lot of cases, and very well done. And by the time you get to say the 1940s or 50s, you see a lot of this kind of projection of the facade has been lost. Things are flattened out, and you're mostly seeing just kind of 1x trim boards just kind of stuck on the facade, on the stucco, trying to look like this. But these are much more nicely done in this period. So here's another nice example, church right in the center of Winchester here. And I'm kind of zooming in over at the left. So here you can actually see pegs from mortise and tenon connections. So these to me on the left part here actually look like heavy timbers, or a very thick approximation of a heavy timber frame that is actually pegged together with dowels. You see them poking out there. Over on the right, that looks like they bumped out an addition at some point in time, and we're trying to pick up on that detailing, but you don't see any of the pegs on the right on that later addition. So not quite as faithful as the early 20th century when they were really trying to get those details right and pull it off in a very convincing way. So what about the overall form? And maybe just to kind of refresh your memory before I move on, take a look at the profiles. Look at how the first floor steps out a little bit, the second floor a little bit more, the third floor or gable ends more, and even the roof more beyond that. So it's a constant out, 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 out on all these facades. So, is that just purely stylistic? Where does that come from? Sometimes you hear that people say, well, back in that period, they were just trying to eke out any sort of space they could get in the dense medieval city. It was very congested and crowded, and they were just trying to pick up a little more space on the upper floors out over the street. So, I've kind of diagrammed that form in the upper diagram as an inverted step pyramid is basically what those buildings are doing. And you occasionally see that inverted step pyramid form on more modern buildings like Boston City Hall, brutalist building from the 1960s. And occasionally we see step pyramids, not just Mayan temples, but modern buildings as well that kind of step up a hillside, have terraces, have pavilions, all over occupied space. So I'd call that the step pyramid form. And both those kind of basic building forms, building enclosure forms, transcend history. And again, you have these contemporary examples as well, as you see on the left. The lower left is an Antoine Pradock building just outside Los Angeles from the 1990s. So, one of these works a lot better than the other. So you can imagine that structurally, the step pyramid works pretty well. You could stack up your kids' old blocks and they would be very stable in that form. So why do these jettied buildings have this inverted step pyramid form? Well, that form works a lot better for managing rain, managing the weather, managing wind-driven rain. And of course, the facade materials on those buildings were an exposed timber frame. So the structure of the building, the wood that's holding the building up was exposed to the weather. They were trying to protect it. And what they infilled between the wood, what we call stucco today, that was originally wattle and daub. So it was essentially basically like wicker, like you were weaving a basket. And that was just filled and packed with, sometimes with clay, sometimes with a lime-based stucco, but all those materials really didn't like to get wet. So this form was a way to take those moisture-sensitive materials and really protect them well from the weather. So, you look around and we have a lot of building forms like this in New England. So here's the Paul Revere House, second oldest building in Boston, 1680. And you look closely and it really has that inverted step pyramid form. So kind of early English settlers had learned that building form. They brought it over here with them. And even though they weren't exposing the frame anymore and they didn't have wattle and daub, they had clapboard protecting it, they were still building in that same form. And actually, as you look around, really other periods and styles. So, going from left to right, Paul Revere House, and then early 19th century Greek Revival, late 19th century kind of Queen Anne, and then on the right, some early 20th century kind of eclectic or period revivals, kind of the Tudor revival on the right. You'll see that form again and again. It's sometimes very subtle, but once you start seeing it, like me, you'll kind of walk around Winchester and say, oh yeah, there's another one. Oh yeah, there's another one. And you'll see them again and again. So that really has a function of really protecting the building from the weather and shedding water, clearing it down to the ground and protecting the facade and the windows as well from wind-driven rain. And it's really not just kind of these Tudor and Elizabethan buildings in England that you see where you see this precedent. It's really all over Europe. So in the Italian Alps was the second photo on the left. And even in Venice, this form is very common, especially south and west of the Grand Canal, where the storms really blow in and batter these buildings. Having the best protection you can against the weather is pretty important. Ledges and band courses I'd like to talk about. So what do I really mean by that? Well, I mean these kind of continuous horizontal elements that you see on Lincoln School, here above Starbucks and up above Bookends on the right. Are these just purely decorative? They kind of just wanted to articulate the facade in some way, or are they really doing something practical or functional? That they have some sort of logic in construction. And of course, you see these all across Rome, where I lived for a year. It's just any kind of period or style. Buildings that are 500 years old or that are 100 years old. You kind of see it again and again across the centuries. So facades and streetscapes that look like the one on the right are just really common. Almost every floor line gets articulated with a band course. So again, ask the question, is that just purely stylistic, or does it have any sort of construction logic? So if it did not have any construction logic, you could take a facade and just strip all that and say that's just kind of ornamental frippery we don't need. We could just clean it up and have it purely plainer. Why do all these buildings have it? So in the center, I've kind of drawn a section of one of the buildings I studied when I was in Rome that has all those articulations, and then kind of a conjectural modern version of it where everything is just purely clean. clean and flat and plainer. So if it's not doing anything for a living, you could make that adaptation or change. If it is, there might be some consequences to that. So long story short, these actually are important, and here's why. So these buildings in Rome are thick, load-bearing mass masonry buildings. So the walls are very thick. Often they're on the order of 3 feet thick, and all the floor loads are carried on these very thick stone or brick walls. And so you've got a very, very thick stone wall. There's no waterproofing, there's no underlayment, there's no felt paper, none of those other things that keep our kind of wood frame houses here in Winchester dry. So the way they work is, even if they're perfectly pointed, even if the stucco is freshened up, stucco, brick, stone, mortar, all those materials are porous and absorptive, and they take on water every time it rains. And it rains a lot in Rome. It rains all winter. So if you're able to cut a section through that wall after it had been raining on it for a while, and the water were tinted blue, it would kind of look like that section I've sketched on the left. So the water is kind of moving down due to gravity, and it's being drawn in due to capillary action. So together those form that kind of angle or gradient. And at the point where that angle gets to the inside, that's where you have leaks, and you've got a problem. So what those band courses really do, those are stone, and they're kind of set back into the facade and built into the brick or into the wall. And so they act almost like a flashing would today in our world here in the States. And they catch that water and they direct it out at every floor line. So they're basically resetting the clock at every floor, so you don't get to the point where that gradient reaches the inside. So that's how they really work. Slate and clay roofing tile. So we have a lot of examples of slate roofs here in Winchester, both on the public buildings and on many of the houses as well. Not too many examples of clay tile, but a few real beauties, as you see, kind of right here in the center of town, and also up on Hillcrest, kind of in the northeast corner of town. Some really nice examples, and one on Church Street in the upper right. So, how do these work? So you obviously know how a shingle works and how that works with respect to the weather, but I wanted to just kind of compare and contrast for a minute slate and clay tile. So this slate on the right is one that I pulled off a building in Framingham that was over 100 years old, about 130 years old at the time. And so this particular slate had metallic minerals in it. So where the water had been running on it, it had kind of turned that rust color. So what's interesting about that is it kind of gives you a map of where the water's been running for all these years. So the bottom part was the part that was exposed. And then I drew on it where the course above was and where the course above that was. So you can see when you have the two slate above, the two shingles above kind of butt together and start to lap over that one. And then the third one, the bottom of that laps over the top. Water gets through that little butt joint. And as it starts to make its way down, it's spreading out too. So that kind of fan shows you where the water has been for all these years. So you would think that, kind of the drawback of that, if you can make, obviously Mother Nature makes slate, but if you can make your own slate, the way to make it a lot more efficient would be to turn up the edges and kind of catch that water so it didn't come off the sides and you kind of funnel it down. And so kind of the earliest clay tile, and here's a clay tile from Rome, second from the left, are essentially doing that. They're turning up the edges, catching that water. And then really you think about, well, how am I going to put these pieces together? Well, rather than just being totally rectangular, you want to kind of funnel that a little bit. So one shingles into the other, kind of like a series of funnels. So on the far right, here's a new clay tile roof being installed in Rome. And you can see that's exactly what it is. It's a series of funnels coming down. And then the only remaining problem is, okay, we've got all these gaps between our funnels. This is called a pan and tile roof, or pan and cap roof. And then we need something to cover those. So here's what they have. They have kind of a half cylinder that tapers the other way. So those all kind of lap over each other, shingle downstream, all the water shingles downstream. And this is the most common roof form in Rome for the past 2,000 years, a pan and tile roof. So it's you see how it's put together. You look at the pieces, and it's almost like it designs itself once you really understand how water flows on it. And that's really why it's worked so well for 2,000 years. And window hoods and pediments, just like to talk about for a minute here. So by window hood or pediment, I'm talking about the thing on top of the window. So really you see some nice examples all around town on houses of different periods and styles. That's Church Street on the right, that's Lincoln School on the far left. And that house second from the left is in Arlington, just really a beautiful example of kind of window hoods, window surrounds, a nice projecting sill. It's kind of an Italianate house, but just really nicely detailed, probably from about mid-1800s. And then Stoneham Center on the second from the right, just some really prominent window hoods on this building right in the center of Stoneham on Main Street. So are those just purely stylistic? Do they really do anything for a living? So really they're doing a couple things. So I'm going back to Rome now for a minute. So we just talked a lot about water. So first and foremost, they're shedding water. And if you think about the days when windows were just pieces of wood, pieces of glass closing against stone. So it was before the days when we had gaskets or membranes or any of these things that keep windows and doors and storm doors kind of tight today. It's just, wood on stone or wood on wood. So really to make those windows work well, you try to divert as much water away from them as you can. Again, just like the overall facade form was doing, you're trying to protect them and shelter them. You're setting the windows far back into the opening. You're having those pediments come out and kind of hover over almost like a little roof or a little umbrella. And in addition, on these stone buildings in Rome, they were doing that water management function, and they were serving as the lintel itself. So they were holding up the wall above. So they were both structural and a water management device as well. And you look at any Italian Renaissance palazzo in Rome, and they've got these on every single window. Often they're one pediment type, like triangular on the first floor, and a different one like a segmental arch, a gently sloping arch on the second floor, and a different one altogether on the third floor. But very, very common. So again, if you look at this window and even this window hood in Rome and the details of it, particularly that bracket on the right, how everything overhangs the thing below, keeps projecting out. It's again almost like a microcosm of our inverted step pyramid form that's worked so well in so many centuries, for so many years, transcending periods and styles. And just one kind of really fun additional side note on this particular building I studied in Rome, Palazzo Braschi. So this was a 1790 building, not particularly old by Rome standards, but built as buildings were there for hundreds and hundreds of years in this kind of form. And I noticed on these window surrounds that there were two holes in the same place on every stone surround. So you see the yellow and red arrows here, a close-up of them here. And of course, buildings that are hundreds of years old in Rome have a lot of holes in them where this has been hung or that has been hung at one point in time. But seeing the holes in the exact same place on every window, something intentional was going on. And what this was again, the difficulty of making windows watertight when it's just wood closing on wood at the meeting rail or wood on stone at the edges. Here, there were two very elaborate series of water collection trough and weep systems, one just outside of the window, kind of the yellow arrows that led to the yellow weep, and one inside the window. So any water that leaked through was caught in this marble gutter, funneled along to the center where that hole was. The hole goes diagonally all the way through the wall, as you see in the center photo here, to a weep tube, which was lead, which was soldered to the marble in the center. So just really sophisticated water collection and weep system from 1790. And I did see this on a couple other buildings there as well. So it wasn't super common, but I did see it on at least 3 buildings. So really pretty remarkable foresight in design logic and construction logic, and how to make things watertight when your palette of materials is pretty limited. And just one kind of fun note, because I love these two houses. So one right up behind the Common on the hill, and another one on Highland on the right. So clipped gables, these are sometimes called, jerkin heads, they're sometimes called, but really beautiful. And that house on the right on Highland probably has a stronger medieval architecture influence, I think, than almost any other house in Winchester, with those kind of clipped gables, those big, strong brackets and corbels, and that kind of sawtooth detail on the upper gable ends. And so really you can kind of look around a lot of places in Europe, but I've picked a couple examples here from the Black Forest, where they just have huge kind of clipped gables, or again, what the English call jerkin heads. And to me, this is again just kind of protecting the building as best you can from the weather when the structural materials are moisture sensitive, and you don't have the waterproofing materials and everything else available today. So to me, these buildings and the clipped gables are almost like the Gloucester fisherman kind of pulling his rain hat down over his ears and turning it down and getting as much coverage as he possibly can from that rain. Almost like a fisherman's hat for a building. And kind of one other kind of quick note here as I wrap up is I've talked a lot about how do you protect moisture sensitive materials when you are going to expose them on a facade. How do you protect them from the rain? So here's the entrance to our public library. Some entrance I think you all know pretty well. And you're walking straight on and you would never know that it has that beautiful tile. Well, why is that? Well, adhered tile in a cold freeze-thaw climate like New England is really hard to make work. If they had put that out on the facade where it was getting wet all winter in our freeze-thaw, it would be all over the ground by now. And cleverly, what they really did was they protected it behind this arch that projects out and hangs over it. So it's really well sheltered by this beautifully detailed arch, and it's in the recess where it just doesn't get the rain washing over it. It's well shielded, so very well thought out. And you kind of see similar thoughtful detailing again in Italy on when and where they use tile mosaics, usually on the interior, but when they put them on the exterior, they're usually pretty thoughtful about protecting them from the weather or putting them in a sheltered location. Large roof to wall overhangs, again, something there are just many, many prominent examples of all around town. And in Italy as well, 2 or 3 feet is not an unusual overhang at all in Rome. And the photo on the right is a school that was right in our neighborhood that I walk by every day. And the overhang on that roof is only about 1.5 feet, which is pretty modest by Roman standards. But you can see from that line in the ground where all the kind of sand and grout between the cobblestone paving is eroded away, where I'm running my cursor right now, just with that 1.5 foot overhang, that really protects the wall pretty well, in this case, the stucco and brick, from that runoff. So roof overhangs really protect siding and make siding last. So just as much in Winchester and in Rome. And kind of on a related note, if your roof is going to overhang pretty far, as these examples do, you need some way to support that. So a lot of times people look at kind of the scrolls, the brackets, the modillions, and think they're purely stylistic. Oh, and that one's Italianate, and that one's kind of colonial revival or craftsman or whatever. But a lot in this period, they were typically kind of serving the function of helping to support that roof overhang. Today, a lot of times on new construction, they are decorative. They would construct the roof support independently as a ladder truss or something else, and then just kind of apply those after the fact. But a lot of times in this period and in older construction in Europe, they were working very hard for a living to help support that roof overhang. So just one kind of quick example of that from Rome as I wrap up. So this is one of the buildings I studied when I was there. So this was best known as the Casa di Dante in Rome. So there's a photo of it on the left. and you have these kind of corbel elements projecting out, and these would actually be a heavy timber that extends underneath the attic trusses, and the attic trusses sit on those. You've got a continuous horizontal rail, and then you've got these rafters at about 1 foot in center that sit on it. And again, you notice wall to corbel to rafter to clay tile, everything again projects out and out and out. So what amazed me most in first looking at this detail is, these are just typically pine. They obviously weren't pressure treated, and they're not cypress or cedar or any other, or mahogany or any other naturally decay resistant wood. So how does pine last in a rainy climate like Rome for 500 years? Because a lot of these are, kind of quite old buildings, and not rot. So that was pretty remarkable. So the way it really works is, this is so well protected by the roof overhang that this hardly ever gets wet. It's well shielded. And then when it does get wet, it dries out pretty quickly. And you might look at this form, the particular kind of scroll cuts and all here, and think, well, that's got to be decorative, right? Well, kind of coming back to our structural engineering, the form that wants to be structurally is a triangle. That's kind of the moment diagram. That's the shape it needs to be to resist those stresses of a point load at the end for something cantilevered out of a rigid wall, which is what it is. So it wants to be a triangle structurally. The part on the underside, the other half of it, wouldn't really be working for you. So you think, well, let's cut off the part that isn't working. But why wouldn't you just leave it? You've already got that wood anyway. Well, if you expose that end grain to the weather, the end grain will take on the water. We'll see that same absorption gradient of water, and the bottom part rots. So it's almost a case of cutting out the part you don't need before the cancer can form of wood rot or fungal decay. And then the third part might be, well, why not just cut it off on the diagonal? Why do you need all those little kind of doodads? And so what all those ornamental or quote unquote ornamental doodads really do is they give you a whole series of drip edges. So because of this generous roof overhang, this structural element hardly ever gets wet. But when you do get the very rare, completely horizontal wind-driven rain, and it does get wet, it's going to shed that water very quickly because of all those kind of de facto drip lines. So it's both beautiful and it's really well thought out in terms of water management and durability.
If you do have some questions, feel free to start putting them in the chat.
Well, let's just go right to the Q&A now.
Are there any questions from the audience?
One, I'd like to know what got you started down this journey. I mean, have you loved architecture as a young man and just, gone on with it, or can you speak to that?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I loved architecture and construction and design as a kid. I was the kid who was always building like tree houses in the backyard and that type of thing. And I knew I wanted to do something like that. And I was kind of talking to my parents in high school about architecture or engineering, and I wasn't sure which. And they said, well, why don't you go to a school that has both? Then if you decide to transfer, you can just walk across campus rather than having to move. So I did that. And at their suggestion, I started with engineering and I liked it. So I never transferred, but then I did it for a couple of years. And then I decided I really want to work on old buildings. So I think architecture and historic preservation is the way to go. So then I went back to grad school for that. And then I finished that and came out and tried to find a place where I could kind of put all that together and not, abandon any of it, but bring it all together. So then I found SGH coming out of grad school, and it's been a place I've been able to do that. So I've been really happy about that.
Alan, you have a question?
Yeah. Just as soon use my voice. Hey, Matt, thanks. This applies to a lot of buildings, but our family happens to have a house that was built in around 1780, and there's practically no overhang at the ends. And so the water, of course, comes down the sides, and it's not like it's impervious. It's a wooden clapboard that you get water intrusion. I wonder why these folks back then were really savvy about how they built stuff. Why did they not put a bigger overhang on then.
Yeah, it's kind of odd there. I mean, you're right. I have seen some 1700s buildings like that. And I'm not sure why that came around, because it seems like you look at the 1600s buildings like the Revere House, and they have a decent roof overhang. And then you see some later construction, once you get into the 1800s, and you see nice, generous roof overhangs. But a lot of those kind of colonial farmhouses, yeah, they don't have much of a roof overhang. And I'm not sure why that is. And in particular, a lot of the very early capes have almost no overhang. And, some people have theorized that, well, a lot of the people who built those were boat builders, or, you had people who worked in shipyards who kind of sometimes built the frames. I'm not sure how true that is. There are a couple examples like the old ship church in Hingham, where that was clearly true, where the structure was built by boat builders, but I'm not sure how widespread that was, but that's at least one theory I've heard about it.
Yeah, I guess ours was right in the wrong time period.
Any other questions?
I have one more. I'm sorry.
Sorry, go. No, don't apologize, please.
I'll make this the last one. So my family home was built, many years before we occupied it, and it was on Myopia Road in Winchester. And it's a stucco home with a very small overhang. And I'll be honest with you, I don't recall anything above the windows. And I'm just curious about it. I do recall about between the floors there was that horizontal decorative piece that it was very functional, I'm assuming, but decorative looking.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm curious of that. Was there any other way? I mean, maybe it was host LED flashing, maybe.
Yeah, sometimes you see at the floor line just a very subtle break, that might only be a couple inches, but sometimes it was a way, with clapboard or with cedar shingle, that they might just be able to get the felt paper or a little flashing to get the water out from the upper story and kind of reset the clock, like we talked about before you get the next story. I mean, when you think about, most houses in Winchester are 2 full stories, and then you've got at least, kind of a half story or an attic or, some gable ends. So on a gable end, you've got 3 stories of height there. If all that water is draining all the way down, that's a good 30 feet. If you can get it out at every floor line, it's only going 9 or 10 feet. So you see quite a bit of that, and it's pretty effective all around town. I think you tend to see it a lot on the clapboard and cedar shingle houses, and certainly on the stucco ones that are kind of jettied or timber, half timbered, or and some of the ones that are kind of more monolithic, maybe not as much.
Interesting. Thank you.
I have a question. If you were to build a brand new house for yourself at this point, what of all these features, what would you make sure that you would include?
Oh, for sure, the big roof overhang. And I think the overall form would have, it may not look like a Tudor Elizabethan house, but I think it would have that form where it steps out a little bit at every level as well. And another thing you see a lot on kind of these older houses and is just kind of a nice stone base. So kind of the logic on that obviously is, you don't just want to end the foundation right at grade. You want to bring it up 3 or 4 feet because snow piles up 3 or 4 feet high, right? So you want to keep the wood above the height at which snow typically accumulates. So, I think that's another one of the things we all just kind of take for granted and think that's just the normal way to build. But, sometimes you look at a ranch or a mid-century house and they are just sitting, the siding, the clapboard, the cedar is just right at grade or a couple inches above. It's not 3 or 4 feet above. So I think all those good functional things would be there.
Thank you. Are there other questions from the audience?
Nancy has a question in the chat, and Nancy, I see you on camera. Do you want to unmute and ask?
Yeah, I thought if I asked, I should unmute. I am in my 1974 mid-century modern house in Riverside, asking about Winchester architecture. I would make one comment about overhangs and slate roofs, and that is that the architects never considered cars, because we totaled our Audi with a snowdrop, with an ice drop one year, and learned the hard way. But my question is really what you think about the new direction of the architecture going up in Winchester, because I see a lot of copycats of stylistic elements that probably aren't functional. So where is architecture going in the next 10, 15 years as we deal with different issues?
I mean, I think in general, where it's going might be a little bit different than where it's kind of currently going in Winchester. I mean, if you think about where the profession is going as a whole, I mean, there are some interesting things going on. People are more and more concerned with sustainability, and I think that's leading to some good things. People are thinking about, again, about how can we site houses really carefully and thoughtfully with respect to climate. How can we make them energy efficient? How can we use materials that don't have a really big carbon footprint, and all those things? And those are important regardless of kind of style, you know, whether the building is kind of contemporary looking or kind of traditional looking. You know, I'm really pleased to see that coming in. I think kind of on the leading edge of the technical side, there are some architects who are doing some very interesting things in terms of taking some of these traditional principles and incorporating them in a way that takes advantage of modern technology. So some architecture in France and in Germany and in Northern Europe that's doing that. Kyle Moe, a friend of mine, and I wrote a paper about a few years ago. And, you know, some have called it like avant-garde vernacular. So taking these really great ideas that work well for a long time and even kind of tweaking them a bit through computer analysis and tools that we have today that they didn't, or through, you know, some sophisticated materials that maybe they didn't, like with respect to windows. So I think all those things are positive. You know, we don't really see that total cutting edge worldwide in Winchester architecture. I think we tend to see maybe three things. We see some houses that are really thoughtfully designed to kind of fit within the local architectural context that we have here in Winchester, you know, architect designed. We see some kind of like spec developer houses that are whatever the current formula or cookie cutter is. And, you know, in the 60s, it was a ranch, and, you know, for period, and now it seems to be kind of a McMansion that's slate blue with white trim, and in the interior, all the walls are gray or white, you know, and it's a formula. And, you know, there isn't a whole lot else going on right now, but those are probably kind of two of the biggest trends.
Thank you.
In Winchester, anyway.
I see a question in the chat. This is from Alan Iden. Is it possible to artificially age concrete to expose the aggregate in new construction?
Yes, it is. And so that was done a lot in the 60s, and it's still done somewhat today. So when you see kind of exposed aggregate concrete on some of these brutalist buildings, you know, there are some Joseph Louis Cert design buildings at Harvard and Boston University. And of course, Paul Rudolph was kind of famous for, you know, texturing or exposing concrete or bush hammering it even as kind of an extreme. Coupled ways it's often done are, I talked about, you know, when they set forms and they pour concrete into the forms, the paste tends to float to all the outer surfaces, form or the top. And so they have chemicals that are called form retarders. So they can brush those onto the forms before they cast the concrete, and that kind of eats away the paste a little bit and holds it back. And the other way it's sometimes done is just, they may do that, or they may not use a form retarder at all. And after they strip the forms, they would abrade it, either with a sandblast or with an acidic chemical or something to eat away the paste a little bit and expose that aggregate. So those are some of the most common ways it's done.
Matt, a question for you. As you look around Winchester and all that you see there, and with your eye, is there a particular house or building that you find noteworthy?
Yeah, well, that the concrete house that I showed at the beginning, kind of the section of what material is it?
Yes.
Which is at that big kind of 5-way intersection where Wildwood takes a sharp turn. That's just really, there are a lot of beautiful houses in Winchester that I admire every time I go by them. But that one to me is unique, that you have a cast in place concrete house. It's the only one I've ever seen in Winchester or any of the surrounding towns. And it is just beautiful, just the patina of it and the color of it. And, I'm just so thankful that no one has ever painted it. I would, if a for sale sign ever goes up, I almost want to go knock on the realtor's door and say, don't tell them to paint it. Don't tell them to freshen it up. It's just beautiful. Just the patina. You just leave it alone.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you.
And I apologize. It's where Wildwood takes a sharp turn, and
yeah, where Wildwood, I guess if you,
like, you could go towards Winter Pond, but
yes, where Bacon comes in, and then the road goes off to Winter Pond and toward the tennis courts.
Okay.
That big crazy intersection, and it's set a little bit back towards, I think it's almost on the corner of Pine Street. Pine Street also comes off that intersection. And it's kind of almost sits at that intersection diagonally.
Well, I don't know that I know it, but I'm going to check it out.
Do we have any other questions in the chat?
Okay, I've got one more. Sorry.
Keep going.
I'm just wondering if this nice man could talk a minute or two on balloon framing, and is that the method in a lot of the old beautiful Winchester homes? And I also want to know if you would have a program for timber framing and interiors of homes and the way they're built.
Yeah, so balloon framing, kind of the big break in the way wood stud frame houses were built. Well, actually, maybe I'll go back a little bit further. So if you have a early 1700s house, like Alan Field mentioned earlier, that would be a timber frame house. So sometimes called post and beam. So essentially you've got big members and kind of mortise and tenon connections, and those make up the main frame of the house. So essentially most of the corners of the house and a few places in between, you've got this really big frame. And then kind of infilling between that, you've got smaller members. And of course, making all those connections, those mortise and tenon connections, was really time consuming in the days before power tools, so building a frame house in the 1700s or 1600s took a long time, a lot of labor. So once we start to get sawmills and we're mass producing lumber and sticks, then in the kind of early to mid 1800s, you get into what was called balloon framing. And what that really means is just the way they built it. They would, if the house is 2 stories tall, the studs would go all the way up 2 stories. So say you have 9-foot stories, those are 18-foot tall studs that are going the whole way. And then they're kind of nailing the floors into it. And after that, the innovation that came around was platform framing. So essentially you would, and that's still how houses are built today, and how I'm in a 1906 house here, and it was built with platform framing. And you go by any construction site today and you see them platform framing. So if the house is 2 stories, they would build walls that are 1 story tall. They would lean them up. They would get all the walls in, and then they would kind of sit the second floor on that. And that makes a platform. And then they've got a place to stand to build the second floor walls. And then they sit the attic floor on that, and then they stand there. So you kind of keep working up. It gives you a place to work, and you don't need as long boards to do that. So, and I think that, that's kind of locally what I've seen here. I think kind of the years and all that plays out a little differently regionally. So I know like balloon framing really took hold in Chicago, and that period lasted a lot longer there because they felt like it was faster to build. So there were some regional differences to what was built when, but that's essentially the difference between balloon and platform. I think today it becomes a little, in addition to not having the convenience of a platform to work on every floor as you're going up, today it's really hard to get 2-story or 3-story long studs that are anything close to straight. The lumber just isn't that good today. When I have to go and buy some studs, even getting an 8-foot long one that's fairly straight, kind of picking them out, half them are twisted, right? So I think that's one of the biggest challenges to platform framing anything today is getting the right lumber to do it.
Thank you. Thank you for your
What
questions.
about other types of programs? Just curious.
that Matthew gives.
Yes.
So Matthew, do you have other programs that you present?
Yeah, I have a lot of lectures I've done kind of for technical groups that are maybe a little too technical to be interesting to this group. But years ago, I did give a talk to the Winchester Historical Society about the topic of my thesis in grad school in historic preservation, which was the ballparks of 1909 to 1923. So that's the period that includes Fenway Park and Wrigley Field and others that are gone now, like Comiskey and Ebbets Field and all that. So that was fun. So maybe we should do that at some point during baseball season.
Sounds like fun.
I'm in.
Well, great.
Okay, will you bring the Cracker Jacks?
Great
Absolutely.
idea.
All right. Well,
Absolutely.
Okay.
thank you, everybody. I think, does anybody have any other questions? I think I just saw one message pop in. Oh, excellent presentation. Learned a lot. Thank you. That was from one of the comments in the chat. So, Matthew, thank you very much for your presentation tonight. Thank you for those who are still on. I think we've gone a little bit over, but I think that that's totally fine. Please come join us again next month. We have our program on the 15th of February, and Nancy Schrock will be sharing the history of the New Hope Church and the Black experience in Winchester. So I think, Electra, you've got some.
I am attempting to share it and it's not visible to the share, so I don't know.
Okay. All right. So that's okay. Hopefully everybody has received the postcards in the mail. And if you haven't, we've posted on Facebook. We are sending out emails and for the rest of the season. But thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening, and have a lovely evening.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you very much, Matthew.
Thanks, Matthew.